Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more. As the train approached Westbury station, it gradually slowed down. Evan recognized the station's name from the conductor's announcement as he passed through the car. Other passengers were also preparing to disembark, checking their belongings. Evan gathered his books and the remaining snacks he had purchased on the train, observing the scenery outside the window as the train approached the station. The landscape had transformed slightly since he last looked out 2 hours ago. Rural scenery had given way to the worn-out surroundings of this old New England manufacturing village. Evan was aware that just outside the town, there were still grand mansions and historic farms. Listening to the rhythmic sound of the train tracks winding down, he pondered the reason for this trip. Earlier that morning, he had left St. Andrews, complying with his mother's decision that he spend the summer with her old school friend, whom he referred to as Aunt Eleanor, while she embarked on a European tour with her companion, Clifford Graves. He presumed this decision was largely influenced by the trouble he had gotten into last semester at St. Andrews. It was evident that he was on thin ice with the headmaster at St. A's. There were the usual minor pranks, but his involvement in the panty raid at Eastmoor, and worse, being caught, had exacerbated matters. During the uncomfortable meeting with the deans on Tuesday, he and his mother had been informed of his suspension. He would remain on the school's rolls throughout the summer and fall semesters but would not be allowed to return until after the Christmas holiday, contingent upon satisfying the school that his behavior had improved. His strong desire to graduate from the prestigious prep school had greatly influenced his mother's decision to send him to Westbury. Aunt Eleanor, she had mentioned, was a certified teacher, meeting the state and school requirements for enrollment. Privately tutored, she had suggested to the headmaster. To Evan, she had hinted at another motive he didn't fully grasp, that Aunt Eleanor could instill refinement and discipline, qualities his mother believed he lacked. She had vaguely referred to English methods, a reference that eluded him but which she spoke of with certainty that it was what he needed. He longed to return to St. Andrews, and this seemed like a potential path back. As the train approached the station, uncertainty weighed heavily on his mind. He knew little about Aunt Eleanor beyond a faint memory of meeting her at a Connecticut estate one summer. He was to spend at least the summer with her and, according to his mother, might even have to stay until Christmas based solely on Aunt Eleanor's judgment. The uncertainty of time, coupled with his ignorance of the references his mother had made regarding the particular skills this woman supposedly possessed, filled him with apprehension. What added to his anxiety were two other facts. Firstly, his mother had insisted he submit entirely to Aunt Eleanor's authority, and secondly, all his discretionary funds, save for a small amount in his pocket, were now under this other woman's control. Once he stepped off the train, his ability to make decisions for himself would be severely limited. Finally, the train came to a halt, and he grabbed his bag, making his way towards the exit. The black porter had positioned the portable footstep at the base of the stairs, and he descended onto the station platform. He was recognized before he spotted the woman. She called out his name, and he looked up to see a vaguely familiar face. She was an attractive woman in her early 30s, dressed stylishly with an air of confidence. His initial impression was that she deliberately concealed any softness about herself in the somewhat austere way she wore her auburn hair, pulled back in a French twist. It was clear she only shopped at the finest stores, and he was certain he had seen her ensemble in one of his mother's Bergdorf's catalogues just a month ago. Equally intriguing was the young girl by her side, evidently her companion, as she followed Eleanor towards him. The girl appeared to be around his own age of 14 but dressed strangely in a manner that seemed old-fashioned and somewhat childish. She was strikingly pretty with long hair pulled back into a flowing ponytail topped with a straw boater hat adorned with a blue ribbon. She wore patent leather shoes and a dress that flared out with petticoats visible at the hem. Her attire was fancy, the kind worn only to formal or celebratory events. What intrigued him most was her demeanor. She seemed reserved and shy, clearly deferential to Eleanor's commands. He was introduced to her and learned her name was Grace. She seemed uncomfortable, initially starting to curtsy before tentatively extending her gloved hand to his own. The introductions were formal, with Eleanor being both ingratiating yet authoritative in her reception. With an air of superiority, she handed a red cap to convey his luggage, and they proceeded through the terminal to the luxurious car she had arrogantly parked in the no-parking zone at the curb. Once his bags were loaded, he settled into the back seat of the car, his gaze alternating between the two women in the front seat and the countryside unfolding outside. Eleanor's remarks were sparse, though she alluded to his troubles at St. A's and the apparent discussions she had had with his mother about instilling some temperance, as she phrased it, in one's behavior. Eleanor concluded that with time, all issues could be resolved. He fell silent as the car ventured down a smaller road into farm country. Eventually, they arrived at Eleanor's residence, a sprawling white Victorian house situated on several acres of land. She parked the car near the entrance and instructed him to gather his bags and follow her. The girl offered little assistance, though she held the doors and steadied him as he struggled up the few steps to the porch and into the foyer. Eleanor suggested, or rather, directed, that Grace accompany Evan upstairs to his room to store his overnight bag, his trunk would follow, and then return downstairs to the study. Grace obediently complied, pausing at the foot of the stairs for him to catch up. At the top of the stairs, she opened a white door, and he entered, passing the girl without noticing the room itself. It was only after he stepped inside that he realized the incongruity of the room. The room was entirely pastel blue, but that wasn't its most startling feature. The four-poster bed was adorned with a canopy, draped with delicate layers of sheer fabric. Ruffles of eyelet and lace cascaded from beneath the mattress, while the bedspread matched the satin of the canopy. Dainty shams covered the multitude of pillows at the headboard. The furniture, white and gold French provincial, included a chest of drawers and nightstands. A small vanity draped with the same material sat beneath a large lighted mirror. Another three-sided mirror, reminiscent of those in clothing stores, was embedded into the wall. He was certain that Grace had led him to the wrong room, but when he questioned her, she timidly assured him that there was no mistake. Appalled to be lodged in such delicate surroundings, he nevertheless deposited his small bag and followed Grace downstairs to where Eleanor awaited. Grace left Evan at the parlor door, and he entered to find Eleanor seated in an overstuffed chair, leafing through what seemed to be a stack of letters. Upon his entrance, she peered at him over the half-moons of her reading glasses. It's considered polite and refined, young man, to knock before entering a closed room. I'm sorry. I thought you had asked me to. His words trailed off as she waved her hand dismissively. Never mind, we'll address that later, she said. Sit down, indicating the straight-backed Shaker chair beside her own. Chastened by the sharpness of her reprimand, he complied. She continued to flip through the papers, occasionally pausing to read before flipping backwards or forwards, as if confirming or recalling some point. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock pendulum and the rustling of the papers. Finally, she laid the papers in her lap and removed her glasses, massaging the bridge of her nose with thumb and forefinger. The sigh that accompanied this action conveyed a sense of exasperation, he thought, and he felt uneasy in the continued stillness of the room. While she continued to knead her fingers, she broke the silence that had enveloped the parlor. I have been reviewing the materials your mother sent me. It's evident that your conduct during your first semester at St. Andrews was far from exemplary, she stated, slipping her glasses back on and picking up the papers. Dean Hartwick's letter to your mother is quite specific and equally damning in outlining the circumstances of your suspension. He enumerates, by my count, 8 infractions in just 3 months. Removing her glasses again, she regarded him scornfully. Are you determined to get expelled? She queried reproachfully. Not at all, Eleanor. In fact, I am eager to graduate. I can explain. She cut off his attempt at explanation as though it were inconsequential to her. Your behavior seriously jeopardizes your likelihood of graduating, young man. According to this, without evidence of a significant change in attitude, your chances of accessing an Ivy League school through St. A's are slim. I know Dean Hartwick, partly by reputation, and he doesn't exaggerate matters. Perhaps you should consider a public high school and a state university. Of course not, he protested. I want to return to St. A's. I acted foolishly, but some progress, she interjected. Acknowledging even token responsibility is commendable. But your actions are juvenile, Evan, and they demonstrate a serious lack of self-discipline and respect for established rules. Surely you understand that a school as old and traditional as St. Andrews enforces rules for a reason. She paused, examining the letters again. Look at these. Absent from dormitory at 3 a.m. and later detained by township police. Open participation in and encouragement of a rebellious demonstration in the dining room. She glanced over her glasses at him before continuing. A food fight. Participation in an extended course of deliberate harassment of one of the oldest and most distinguished members of the faculty. My God, the list goes on and on. Removing her glasses again and using them as an accusatory pointer directed at him, she added, it's largely due to your late father's generosity to his alma mater that they extend this generous offer of a second chance. But I can assure you, the conditions set for earning that second chance are far from lenient. His ears burned as he sat silently through the litany and subsequent commentary on his behavior. Finding it difficult to maintain eye contact, he looked away in embarrassment as she continued. Please, tell me, what motivated these childish acts? Rebellion? Immaturity? Were you attempting some feeble defiance of authority and rules through misguided independence? Tell me, Evan, what led to this foolish behavior? They weren't my idea, Eleanor. I just went along with. Once again, she interrupted him, this time with haughtiness and abruptness. Just went along. Good Lord, young man, it's disgraceful. Those men at that school are tasked with instilling discipline in you young fools just as much as they are with teaching you Latin. I trust your Latin skills are better than your ability to control yourself. The comment felt unnecessary and belittling, causing him to once again gaze at the floor as she continued her tirade. She now stood towering over him, having abandoned her seat to become an almost overwhelming presence before him. Self-control is paramount for a young man aiming for success, true success in this world. Most young men your age seem to grasp this instinctively. You must cultivate a profound respect for the rules of the institution you belong to. Initiative is one thing, but the behavior outlined in those letters is foolish and bizarre. Open defiance of convention and tradition will never be tolerated in the circles you aspire to. Do you comprehend that? She glared down at him, and his fleeting return of her gaze was met with a meek nod of agreement. She stood in silence for a moment before returning to her seat, settling herself gracefully yet exuding a sense of dominance. Once again, she examined the documents before laying them down, removing her glasses, and speaking deliberately and firmly. I can only assume then, that your excuse for this insolent behavior is to be excused because you succumbed to the macho pressures of your peers, some of whom have already been expelled. Clearly, your distorted sense of ego and identity has clouded your judgment. The lecture was wearing him down. Twice now, he had resisted the urge to challenge her insinuations, restrained by his mother's insistence that he comply with Eleanor's guidance and possible criticism. I suspect, she continued, interpreting his silence as agreement, that must be the case. And if it is, it's a trait you must rid yourself of. Blindly following the crowd out of a misguided sense of male bonding is absurd. Moreover, it's a rejection of the conventions that people of refinement hold dear. It's not any individual action, but the pattern of behavior that leads me to believe you lack significant sensibilities. She referenced the dean's letter again, quoting exhibits an insolent disregard of refined behavior. Would you not agree with that assessment? I don't know, he replied weakly. You don't know, she scoffed in response. Well, I do, and my experience with boys like you compels me to agree with the observation. Now, if you're so intent on graduating from that school, What plan do you propose to modify your attitude and conduct? He regarded the question as rhetorical, knowing his only response would be another feeble "I don't know," so he simply shook his head. I pose that question, she continued, because I am inadvertently involved in your improvement. Your mother is an old friend, and Dean Hartwick's agreement to send you here indicates he values my assurance to him in the fall that you have sufficiently refined yourself to return to classes. There it was, he thought. The mandate for this woman to oversee his life for the next few months stemmed not only from his mother's decision but was also endorsed by the dean. A sense of dread washed over him, fueled by the belief that all of this was leading to something ominous. You see, young man, I have experience in instilling refinement and grace in difficult children of both genders. I was, for many years, a headmistress at Eastmoor, coincidentally, the very school where you engaged in your midnight escapade through the girls' undergarments. I have had some success in cultivating grace and polish. After meeting you, I am prepared to undertake this task as a favor to your mother. Silence hung in the air, leaving him to stew in his thoughts. Her last words pushed him further from any hope of escaping whatever penitential plan she was concocting. Let me make this clear, she continued, as if finality was forming in her mind. It is indisputable that you will not be readmitted next year without my endorsement, and I do not intend to give that approval unless I see improvement. Secondly, that endorsement will not be forthcoming unless you comply with whatever program I devise, and do so willingly and obediently. Do you understand? With no grasp of what she had in store, he resigned himself to the inevitable and nodded in agreement. I'm still intrigued by this so-called panty raid at Eastmoor. So juvenile. Did you find it thrilling to rifle through those intimate garments? I've always wondered what drives a young man to do such a thing. His silence prompted her to continue. Perhaps it was just a matter of fitting in, Evan? Nonetheless, it gives me an idea. Maybe that's the solution. You see, there's a practice in England for taming defiance. They call it petticoat discipline. Have you heard of it? He shook his head, the literal meaning escaping him, assuming it meant submission to feminine authority. She gazed out the window, lost in thought, tapping the stem of her glasses against her cheek. Yes, she declared with determination, that will be it exactly. Evan, I need a firm promise from you that you will unquestioningly obey every command I give you, no matter how unpleasant. It will be a start to see if we can instill some self-restraint. If I detect any resistance, I will not hesitate to withdraw from this endeavor and inform the dean and your mother. Do we have an agreement? It felt like a trap, a solicitation of blind compliance. Later, he would reflect that his ignorance of what lay ahead and his reliance on her authority led him to agree. After reaffirming his promise following a restatement of her rules, she instructed him to wait in the foyer and send Grace in to her. He obeyed, crossing to the door and finding Grace seated on the bench outside the parlor. After delivering the message, he joined her, resigned to whatever lay ahead. From his position, Evan took in the expansive walnut-paneled foyer, with the living and dining rooms adjacent. He could just make out the partially open door to the large, paneled library. Surveying the surroundings, he admired the spaciousness and quality of the place. It struck him that the house was not only sizable but also very old. Through the Tudor windows, he caught glimpses of a pool, what seemed to be a riding stable, and extensive wooded grounds. In the brisk New England winters, he mused, one could likely enjoy cross-country skiing right in their own backyard. Evan recalled that Eleanor had mentioned working as a school headmistress for a time, but he also remembered his mother saying she had been a business consultant before settling in this area. He couldn't help but wonder how successful she must have been to retire to such an expansive estate. Lost in his thoughts, Evan became aware of another scene unfolding in the adjacent parlor. Eleanor looked up as Grace entered, offering a polite curtsy before waiting for instructions. I've given him the ultimatum, Grace, and now we'll move on to phase 2. It's been some time, and you may have forgotten, but we need to give him time to think things over and set the stage for this afternoon. I trust you'll handle lunch for me. It's all been prepared, Eleanor instructed. Yes, Grace replied. Do you think he'll be trouble? I doubt it, dear. In many ways, he has more at stake than you did when you arrived just 6 months ago, Eleanor reassured her ward, casting a fond glance in her direction. Rest assured, by supper time, our stubborn young man will be feeling quite uncomfortable in his new role. Anyway, ensure lunch is ready, and then join us. You'll have plenty of time to prepare while he sleeps. And remind Sophie she can start setting up upstairs while we dine. He should be asleep within the hour. Grace curtsied once more and left to set the luncheon table. Passing by Evan, still seated on the bench, a sense of déjà vu washed over her as memories of similar events from half a year ago resurfaced. She wondered how this young man would react to what lay ahead. Despite her own past feelings of terror and panic, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for Evan, knowing he would soon experience those same emotions, along with the accompanying sense of defeat and humiliation. Moments later, Eleanor emerged and announced lunchtime in an impassive tone. Still reeling from their earlier encounter, Evan followed her into the spacious dining room, taking the only remaining seat after she had seated herself. He felt a slight sense of satisfaction that she didn't comment on his momentary lapse in manners. Indeed, she seemed entirely unaware of his presence. He was quietly grateful that she didn't continue her previous lecture. The kitchen door swung open, and Grace entered with a tea trolley bearing small sandwiches and soup. She placed a serving before each of them and quietly exited the room. The meal proceeded in silence. Throughout the meal, Grace appeared and disappeared, attending to their needs with a practiced efficiency. Evan couldn't help but find it odd that a schoolgirl would be so adept at such tasks. Eleanor seemed to pick up on his thoughts and smiled, gesturing towards Grace. This young lady gave her parents quite a challenge. Yet, removed from the harsh urban environment, she has turned out rather well, don't you think? Grace seemed a bit flustered by the attention, starting to thank Eleanor before being promptly interrupted. Grace, I was addressing our guest, Eleanor interjected firmly, causing Grace to fall silent. Evan offered a polite comment about Grace's character, to which Eleanor responded with a broad smile. Indeed, she is. Oh, the challenges she presented her parents over the years. But that's all behind us now. We see progress every day. Grace returned with a tray of small glasses, placing a blue one beside Evan. It's my custom to have sherry at lunch. Welcome to my home, Evan, and I hope your stay proves beneficial, Eleanor said, raising her glass slightly. Evan took a sip of the warming liquid, feeling somewhat unaccustomed to the taste of the wine. As he drank, Eleanor continued her conversation, mainly elaborating on the earlier discussion about proper behavior and the importance of manners and refinement. He noticed occasional references to Grace and her past demeanor, along with the improvements she had made. The conversation was somewhat personal, and he was relieved that Grace was mostly out of earshot. Despite his fatigue from the overnight trip, Evan didn't object when offered a second drink by Grace. Eleanor's voice continued in the background, discussing the importance of curbing destructive behavior in young people and reminiscing about stricter standards of behavior in Victorian England. She gestured towards Grace. A fine young lady now, isn't she, Grace? This time, Grace responded politely to the direct question. Yes, thank you, Evan found it increasingly difficult to stifle the yawns that welled up within him, eventually succumbing to a broad yawn that he quickly concealed. He suddenly felt overwhelmingly sleepy. But enough of this. Evan, you seem tired. You should rest. Go up to your room and lie down, Eleanor suggested. Evan thanked his hostess and Grace, acknowledging that it had indeed been a long day for him. He refrained from admitting that the potent Madeira wine was also contributing to his fatigue, but he did remark that Grace seemed like a very nice girl. Eleanor nodded gravely, confiding in him after Grace had left that the girl had been quite a problem to her parents initially, but a year removed from her previous environment had been just what she needed. Evan nodded along, struggling to fully comprehend the eccentric statements being made around him. Eleanor continued, expressing her belief that young people nowadays needed much more supervision to prevent them from becoming coarse and unmanageable. Evan listened, only partially grasping the conversation, but he ventured a response nonetheless, which seemed to greatly please Eleanor. "Do you, now? Do you indeed? Well, my dear, I'm sure you and I will get along just fine." "This is very good, indeed," Eleanor exclaimed, much to Evan's relief. As he excused himself and headed off to bed, Evan climbed the stairs somewhat unsteadily, having to steady himself with a hand on the banister. He reached his room, undressed, and slipped beneath the covers, quickly falling into a deep sleep. Several hours later, Evan stirred from his slumber, initially disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. As he gradually became more alert, he noted the delicate furnishings of the room, feeling out of place in such girlish surroundings. He resolved to gently request a room that was less dainty, hoping Eleanor would understand. Shifting his legs, he noticed the smoothness of the sheets, suspecting them to be satin. Despite his initial aversion to the room's decor, he found himself enjoying the tactile sensation of the cool, slippery fabric against his skin, indulging in the childlike pleasure it provided. Evan's initial confusion intensified as he failed to locate his overnight bag on the bureau where he was sure he had left it. Mentally retracing his steps, he became increasingly alarmed when he couldn't find his shorts either, despite his certainty that he had either dropped them by the bed or tossed them onto a nearby surface. Sitting up in apprehension and astonishment, Evan meticulously searched every corner of the room, but his clothes were nowhere to be found. In a near frenzy, he leapt from the bed, inadvertently knocking over the bedside lamp as he checked beneath the bed, finding nothing but dust and floorboards. Perplexed and distraught, Evan struggled to comprehend how all his clothes could have vanished. His only plausible explanation was that someone had removed them while he slept, but the question of why remained unanswered. Sinking onto the edge of the bed, Evan's panic peaked when he noticed a gown neatly laid across its foot. Picking it up, he examined the peach-colored satin robe, its feminine design confirming his worst fears. Clutching the robe as a futile shield against his nudity, he scoured the room in desperation, hoping against hope to find his own clothes, but all he discovered were garments clearly belonging to a woman. Evan's attempt to hide behind the closet door was futile as Eleanor entered, illuminating the room with a flick of the switch. Caught off guard and exposed, he clutched the robe in a feeble attempt to cover himself. Unfazed by his predicament, Eleanor instructed him to put on the robe, dismissing his protests about its feminine nature. With no other option, Evan reluctantly complied, struggling with the unfamiliar buttons as Eleanor impatiently waited. Once he emerged from behind the door, feeling utterly foolish in the ruffled garment, Eleanor's disdainful remark only deepened his embarrassment. Following her lead down the hall, Evan hoped to avoid any further humiliation, praying for the return of his own clothes. Entering the study adjacent to Eleanor's bedroom, Evan took a seat as directed, facing her across the desk. Eleanor wasted no time in declaring the start of his lessons, criticizing his behavior at lunch and warning him that their time for negotiation was running out. Feeling a mix of guilt, remorse, and growing apprehension, Evan couldn't shake the sense of vulnerability brought on by his ludicrous attire and Eleanor's authoritative demeanor. With each passing moment, the gravity of his situation became increasingly apparent. As Eleanor laid out her plan, Evan's sense of disbelief and indignation grew. The realization that his own clothes were gone, replaced by the feminine gown he wore, sent a surge of panic through him. How could she expect him to comply with such a humiliating demand? Her sarcastic tone grated on him as she insisted that he would wear girls' clothes during his time under her care. The threat of consequences loomed large, leaving him torn between his objections and the fear of what refusing would entail. As Eleanor declared the imminent start of his indoctrination, Evan's protests fell on deaf ears. He felt a rising tide of rage and helplessness, unable to comprehend how he had been thrust into such a surreal and degrading situation. Tears threatened to spill from his eyes as he struggled to contain his emotions. He couldn't bear the thought of submitting to Eleanor's twisted vision of obedience and servitude. The idea of running away crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it as futile. Caught between fury and despair, Evan felt utterly trapped, unable to see a way out of the nightmarish scenario unfolding before him. As Evan sank into the warm water, enveloped by bubbles and steam, a sense of vulnerability and humiliation washed over him. He felt exposed and utterly powerless in the face of Eleanor's demands. The feminine atmosphere of the bathroom only served to deepen his discomfort, amplifying his yearning to escape from this surreal ordeal. Eleanor's voice cut through the silence, her instructions terse and commanding. He nodded silently, understanding that compliance was his only option in this moment of enforced submission. With a heavy heart, he began to scrub himself diligently, trying to maintain a facade of composure despite the turmoil raging within him. As he bathed under Eleanor's watchful gaze, Evan couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. Each moment seemed to stretch into eternity, each movement a reminder of his loss of control over his own fate. But amidst the despair, a spark of defiance flickered within him. Deep down, he knew that he couldn't allow Eleanor to break his spirit completely. Somewhere within him, a glimmer of hope remained, a stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to the cruel whims of fate. And so, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, Evan continued to scrub himself clean, clinging to that fragile ember of resistance as he braced himself for the trials that lay ahead. As Evan processed Eleanor's instructions, a wave of apprehension washed over him. The sight of the safety razor, coupled with Eleanor's explicit directions regarding hair removal, filled him with a sense of dread. He realized with a sinking feeling that Eleanor intended to strip away not just his masculinity, but his autonomy as well. With a heavy heart, Evan resigned himself to the task at hand. He knew that defiance would only invite further punishment, and he couldn't afford to provoke Eleanor any further. Slowly, he reached for the bottle of shampoo labeled Miss Clairol, trying to push aside the rising tide of fear and humiliation. As he began to lather his hair, Evan couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Each movement of the razor, each drop of shampoo, served as a painful reminder of his powerlessness in the face of Eleanor's authority. But amidst the despair, a small voice of defiance whispered within him. He refused to surrender entirely to Eleanor's cruel whims, clinging to the fragile hope that someday, somehow, he would find a way to break free from this suffocating oppression. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, Evan continued to carry out Eleanor's orders, each action a testament to his unwilling submission to her will. And as he stared into the mirror, watching his reflection blur beneath the veil of soap and water, he vowed to himself that he would never forget the indignity of this moment, nor the burning desire for freedom that still flickered within his soul. As Evan hurried through his grooming routine, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Each action, from the careful strokes of the razor to the massaging of shampoo into his hair, felt like a surreal ritual in a twisted ceremony of submission. Despite his efforts to maintain composure, a nagging feeling of humiliation gnawed at him with every passing moment. The pink disposable razor in his hand seemed to mock him, a symbol of his emasculation and the loss of control over his own body. With each swipe of the blade, Evan felt a little piece of his dignity slip away, replaced by a growing sense of vulnerability and shame. The soft fabric of the briefs, though not inherently feminine, felt like a betrayal of his masculinity, a reminder of his powerlessness in the face of Eleanor's tyranny. But even as he grappled with these feelings of inadequacy, Evan refused to surrender to despair. Deep down, a flicker of defiance still burned within him, a stubborn refusal to relinquish his sense of self-worth in the face of adversity. With a heavy heart and a weary soul, Evan forced himself to push aside his doubts and fears, steeling himself for whatever trials lay ahead. And as he stood there, clad in the silky embrace of girls' panties, he vowed to himself that no matter what Eleanor threw at him, he would never allow her to break his spirit. As Evan sat in the chair, surrounded by the trappings of femininity, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in this strange and alien world. The sight of the delicate garments in the drawers, the frilly decorations adorning the room, all served as constant reminders of his current predicament. His discomfort only deepened as Eleanor and Sophie busied themselves with their preparations, their movements efficient and purposeful. It was as if he were merely a prop in their meticulously orchestrated performance, a pawn in their game of control and domination. The stuffed animal and doll on the bed seemed to mock him with their silent stares, a cruel reminder of the childishness of his situation. And the skirted chair beneath him felt like a throne of humiliation, a symbol of his emasculation and subjugation. Despite his growing sense of unease, Evan remained outwardly composed, his expression carefully neutral as he awaited whatever fate Eleanor had in store for him. Deep down, however, a sense of dread gnawed at him, a foreboding of the trials and tribulations that lay ahead. But even in the face of uncertainty and fear, Evan refused to surrender to despair. Somewhere within him, a spark of defiance still flickered, a stubborn refusal to bow down to the whims of his oppressors. And as he sat there, surrounded by the trappings of his feminization, he vowed to himself that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage and resilience. As Eleanor presented the delicate undergarments, Evan's heart sank further. The sight of the panties in his hand brought back memories of past misdeeds, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen from his previous life. His rueful smile quickly faded as he faced the reality of his situation once again. With a heavy heart, he stood up as Eleanor instructed, feeling a flush of embarrassment as he opened his robe to reveal the white panties with their silver satin trim. He couldn't bear to meet Eleanor's gaze, knowing that she was silently judging him for his compliance with her demands. Eleanor's assessment of the panties seemed to confirm his fears, and he braced himself for whatever further humiliation she had in store. His apprehension only grew as she picked up the next item, a camisole, and explained its purpose in her usual authoritative tone. But it was the sight of the training bra that sent a shiver down Evan's spine. He knew all too well what it meant, the symbolic gesture of his complete submission to Eleanor's will. The thought of wearing such a garment, even in the privacy of his own room, filled him with a sense of shame and inadequacy. As Eleanor laid down the ultimatum, Evan felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He knew that resistance was futile, that Eleanor held all the power in this situation. With a heavy sigh, he reluctantly complied with her command, knowing that there was no escape from the fate that awaited him. Evan's heart sank further as he felt the weight of the bra settle on his chest, a constant reminder of his humiliation. The sensation of the constricting fabric around his torso only served to reinforce his feelings of vulnerability and powerlessness. As Sophie guided him through the process of putting on the camisole, Evan couldn't help but feel a sense of resignation wash over him. It was clear that every aspect of his appearance was now subject to Eleanor's control, leaving him with no choice but to comply with her demands. Once he was seated again, Evan braced himself for whatever Eleanor had in store for him next. The sight of the garment she held up before him only deepened his sense of dread, its feminine design starkly contrasting with his own sense of masculinity. As Eleanor began to explain the purpose of the garment, Evan felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. It was clear that there was no escaping the reality of his situation, that he was now completely at Eleanor's mercy. With a heavy heart, he resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him, knowing that there was no turning back now. As Evan stood there, encased in layers of petticoats, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of humiliation wash over him. The rustling sound of the fabric, the weight of the layers pressing against his legs, it all served as a constant reminder of his diminished status in Eleanor's eyes. He glanced up at Eleanor, her expression one of smug satisfaction at his predicament. It was clear that she took great pleasure in his discomfort, relishing every moment of his humiliation. Feeling utterly powerless, Evan resigned himself to his fate, knowing that there was nothing he could do to escape Eleanor's control. As Sophie finished securing the final layer of petticoats, Evan couldn't help but feel a sense of despair at the thought of what lay ahead. With a heavy heart, he braced himself for whatever further indignities Eleanor had in store for him, knowing that he was completely at her mercy. As Evan reluctantly approached the mirror, he couldn't help but feel a wave of embarrassment wash over him. His reflection revealed a sight that was utterly foreign and humiliating. A grown man encased in layers of frilly petticoats, swaying awkwardly under Eleanor's scrutiny. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Evan obeyed Eleanor's command to twirl and swish the skirts, feeling utterly ridiculous with each movement. He knew that Eleanor was not impressed by his performance, her dissatisfaction evident in her off-handed remarks to Sophie. Forced to confront his own absurd appearance, Evan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame and humiliation. It was a stark reminder of just how thoroughly Eleanor had asserted her control over him, reducing him to nothing more than a pawn in her twisted game of dominance. As Evan sat at the Vanity, he couldn't shake off the overwhelming sense of humiliation that engulfed him. The reflection in the mirror seemed to mock him, taunting him with his absurd appearance. He felt like he had been reduced to nothing more than a caricature of a man, dressed in layers of feminine clothing. Despite the discomfort and shame, there was an undeniable allure to the soft touch of the fabrics against his skin. He couldn't deny the strange thrill he felt at the sensation of wearing such overtly feminine attire. Yet, the presence of the two women behind him served as a constant reminder of his degradation. With Eleanor's departure, Sophie took charge, bustling around the Vanity and arranging various items with practiced efficiency. As Evan watched her reflection in the mirror, he couldn't shake off the feeling of apprehension about what was to come next. He braced himself for whatever expert talents Sophie had in store for him, dreading the continuation of his ordeal. As Sophie expertly styled his hair, Evan could feel the warm air from the dryer enveloping him, coaxing his hair into soft curls. Despite the discomfort of the air causing his eyes to water, he couldn't help but steal glances at his reflection in the mirror. To his surprise, he noticed that his hair had lightened, taking on a more golden hue than before. Confused at first, Evan tried to rationalize the sudden change in color. Eventually, he realized that it must have been the result of the shampoo used earlier, a detail orchestrated by Eleanor herself. The new shade was subtle, not overly dramatic, but it added a soft amber tint with delicate gold highlights to his hair, further enhancing his transformed appearance. Sophie's skilled hands deftly worked behind him, securing hairpins and creating a knot at the back of his head in preparation for the next step. With precision, she fetched a fleece-like object, colored to blend seamlessly with his own hair. This was a fall, a hairpiece that had been washed with the same shampoo as his own hair, ensuring a natural appearance. While he had slept, Sophie had meticulously curled and styled it to match his hair. Gently, she inserted the comb of the fall into the knot she had crafted, eliciting a slight tear from his eye as it tugged on his hair. Additional pins were used to secure the artificial tresses to his own, creating a seamless blend. Returning to his natural hair, Sophie expertly used a hot iron to fashion soft curls, adding to the overall feminine allure of his appearance. As Sophie deftly tied the large blue satin ribbon around the juncture of the fall and his own hair, securing it with a bow, he couldn't help but be transfixed by the image reflected back at him. It was undeniably him, with his own features staring back from the mirror. Yet, the transformation was undeniable. The cascade of curls framing his face, now a different shade than they had been that morning, seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Despite the lingering sense of chagrin and humiliation, he found himself strangely fascinated by this altered version of himself. It was as though he were gazing upon a distaff twin, a parallel existence veiled in femininity. The reflection was both familiar and unsettling, a testament to the profound changes taking place within and around him. As Sophie carefully dressed him in the navy blue taffeta skirt, Evan's thoughts were momentarily diverted from his distress. The fabric had a subtle sheen reminiscent of satin but with a more muted luster. With expert hands, Sophie lowered the skirt over the billowing petticoats, creating a layered effect. Next came a pastel blue garment, its luminous gloss unmistakable satin. As Sophie helped him into it, the fabric fell loosely over the skirt, creating gentle folds. The elastic cuffs of the sleeves bloused out at the wrists, adding to the feminine silhouette. Evan observed the collar, piped with a contrasting color in a nautical style, dropping down the back of the blouse. He remained still as Sophie adjusted the midi blouse, fastening a ribbon at the neck that matched the one in his hair. The next task was one he was directed to do himself. He pulled on the long white stockings Sophie handed him, stretching them to their full height to cover his knees. However, His efforts fell short of Sophie's standards. She made him stand, adjusting the stockings in the mirror, folding down the tops and allowing the lace trim to form a delicate cuff just below his knees. As Sophie fastened the straps and buckles of the patent leather pumps onto his feet, Evan resigned himself to following her instructions without question. With the shoes in place, he assumed he was fully dressed and ready to leave to confront whatever awaited him. However, Sophie had other plans. She directed him to sit once more at the Vanity, where she presented a tray of small jars. Evan's heart sank as he realized what was coming next: makeup. While he had been made up before for school plays, this felt different. The idea of having his face painted filled him with a sense of unease unlike anything he had experienced thus far. Sophie began with a thin brown pencil, instructing him to keep his eyelids as still as possible as she traced a fine line beneath and just above each eye. Next, she used a small sponge-like brush to apply a light blue color to his closed eyelids in long, delicate strokes. Despite his fluttering eyelids, she persisted, applying mascara with a bristled wand to add length and body to his lashes. When he finally dared to look in the mirror again, Evan was astonished at the transformation. The cosmetics had softened his eyes and enhanced the feminine appearance that stared back at him from the mirror. The reflection was a stark reminder of just how far he had been drawn into this surreal world of femininity. As Sophie dabbed spots of carmine rouge on his cheeks and blended them into a faint pinkish blush, Evan felt a sense of finality settle over him. The moment the tube of lipstick was uncapped, he knew it symbolized more than just the application of makeup. It represented the completion of his transition and his submission to the circumstances thrust upon him. With a mix of sadness and resignation, he mimicked the awkward contortion of his lips as Sophie demonstrated, allowing the color to be spread over his lips. As he made his way to Eleanor, he caught a brief glimpse of himself in the mirror and felt disconnected from the person staring back at him. It was as if he had stepped into another body, leaving his past life behind. Closing the door to the bedroom behind him, Evan unwittingly sealed the fate of his former self. A new life, dictated by the whims of women and beyond his control, lay ahead. In his current state of helplessness, he could do nothing but acquiesce. Little did he know, the events unfolding around him would shape him into a new, far more compliant individual. Standing in the hallway for the first time was disorienting. Unlike the enclosed bedroom, the wide, ornate upstairs hallway made him feel exposed, almost naked. The brightness of the light outside intensified this sensation. In the bedroom, he could at least rationalize his attire as something forced upon him. But out here, with no walls to shield him, he felt vulnerable and uncertain. The thought of someone encountering him in his current state was terrifying. Here I am, a 19-year-old boy, in petticoats, skirts, and a midi blouse, he imagined himself saying, and the idea filled him with dread. Yet, amidst the fear, there was a strange sense of exhilaration. The novelty of his situation sparked a mix of conflicting emotions within him, leaving him unsure of how to proceed. As he walked, the sensation of his naked legs against the fabric of his skirts was a new experience for him. He couldn't help but wonder if this was how girls felt all the time when wearing skirts. Yet, his freshly shaven thighs were causing him discomfort, with an annoying itching that demanded his attention. Stopping to soothe his itching thighs, he rubbed them together, inadvertently noticing the pleasing sensation of his smooth tricot panties and the playful tickle of the ruffle hems of his petticoats. Despite the humiliation of his situation, he couldn't deny the slightly erotic feeling that came with wearing such feminine garments. He couldn't help but imagine that if he wasn't being coerced into wearing these clothes, it might even be fun, at least for a little while. In the privacy of his bedroom, with no chance of anyone finding out, it could have been quite arousing. But Eleanor had stripped him of any choice in the matter, leaving him uncertain of how long he would be subjected to this humiliating feminine fashion. As he made his way downstairs to the study where Eleanor awaited him, the sensation of the numerous petticoats beneath his skirt surprised him. It was difficult to walk with these frilly, girlish undergarments tickling his thighs. But what was even more distressing was the sound they made. In the silent hall, with its expensive carpet and heavy furniture, The sound of his own walking seemed amplified. The swishing of the skirts as he moved felt utterly shameful, and he was sure everyone in the house would be able to hear him. With each step, the billowing female garments pulled and bounced, creating a sensuous sound that only served to heighten his embarrassment. He couldn't imagine how he would ever be able to enter a room with other people present dressed like this. The thought of being seen in such a humiliating outfit filled him with dread. As he reflected on everything that had happened so far, he realized that each step seemed to bring him further under female control, and each experience was more degrading than the last. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. If Eleanor ever expected him to go outside like this, he was certain he would panic. Standing at the top of the stairs, Evan fidgeted nervously, feeling uncomfortable in his new restraining garment. The bra, to him, was a symbol of utter degradation, with dozens of tight, biting elastic straps that seemed to constrict him at every movement. He squirmed his shoulders, trying to relieve the bra strap's awful bite, but to no avail. He felt utterly powerless, resigned to the fact that resistance was futile at this point. He knew, with fearful certainty, that he had better submit to Eleanor's cruel demands right away, or face even worse, unimaginable punishments. With that thought, he steeled his nerves for the awful walk down the stairs. He felt naked and exposed as he stepped, with unaccustomed daintiness, onto the huge open stairway. A wave of shameful humiliation washed over him as the multiple layers of petticoats rustled and tickled him with each step. Now, a new embarrassment arose as his entire skirt actually bounced on the floating petticoats as he descended the stairs. He wanted to close his eyes, to escape the gaze of anyone who might see him. By the time Evan reached the first floor, his cheeks had turned a deeper shade of red than Sophie had initially painted them, his sense of shame and embarrassment palpable. Evan sashayed, shamefully, towards the study, his embarrassment weighing heavily on him as he worried about what other unpleasant surprises his Aunt Eleanor might have in store for him. Tears began to well up in his eyes as he stood before the heavy wooden door of her study, knowing that he would have no choice but to accept whatever Eleanor demanded of him. He would have to change his behavior or endure more of this unbearable, girlish torture. Timidly, the panty-clad boy knocked on the door. "I'll be with you in a minute," Eleanor explained after opening the door. "Now, show me that you're going to behave yourself, dear. Sit quietly on that bench until I'm ready." With that, and not a word about his girlish appearance, Eleanor re-entered the study and closed the door. Evan surveyed the long, hardwood bench opposite the doorway, noting its unusual plainness compared to the elaborate ornate furnishings elsewhere in Eleanor's home. The imagery of a young schoolboy, or, shudder, schoolgirl, for that matter, waiting outside the principal's office was not lost on him. With an unceremonious plop, he heaped himself, and his billowing costume, on the hard wooden bench, sitting with his ankles crossed and knees spread wide in a most girlish fashion. Despite his lovely long tresses, billowing petticoats, and ruby lips, he still seemed very much a boy in a skirt. From the careless way he had seated himself, his lovely petticoats were all bunched up beneath him, and the hem of his pretty flared skirt had been creased. Thus, seated in this way, with his arms spread along the backrest of the bench, Evan awaited Eleanor's return. "Care for a jelly bean?" Grace asked coyly, startling the poor petticoated boy so much that he nearly jumped off the bench. In an instant, he realized his plight, feeling mortified, embarrassed, and utterly ashamed at being caught in a skirt by a girl his own age. What would she think of him? He turned away from Grace, sliding roughly to the opposite end of the bench, staring at the ground, unable to bear the prospect of her inevitable teasing. Grace remained silent as she approached the shivering, panty-clad boy, walking to his side of the bench and then turning with a practiced, ladle-like gesture to smooth her skirt beneath her as she sat down, ensuring her petticoats fell evenly and her skirt remained unwrinkled. "If it's any help, I think it's a nasty thing she's doing to you," Grace said with genuine tenderness. Evan, his trepidation and shame overwhelming, could only gesture weakly. "Really, I do," Grace added. "Most of the time, Eleanor's not so bad. But sometimes, she can be so mean that I can't stand her." Slightly relieved that he wasn't being further humiliated, Evan was able to relax slightly. Grace offered a tissue, and the skirted boy wiped his tear-stained cheeks, gradually confiding in Grace about how utterly humiliated he felt. For her part, Grace tried to be supportive, friendly, and understanding. "Did she give you the speech about when SHE was the head monstrous of a private school?" Grace asked, giggling. "Well, from what I've heard," she continued, "she got bounced out of there. Seems she was too nasty for most of the faculty to stand." Evan smiled in spite of himself. "How long do you think she'll keep me like this?" he asked Grace eagerly, still so embarrassed he could hardly look directly at her. Grace tried to reassure him. "She's only doing it to upset you, Evan. Just don't let it get to you. And above all, don't give her any reason to keep doing it." Evan shivered in his skirts. "But what does she want?" he implored. "Look, just behave yourself. She'll soon see this is ridiculous. I'm sure she'll lose interest. I bet she's just afraid of you, Evan." "That must have been some heck of a report," Grace replied, skillfully drawing Evan out of his shell. "I guess I was pretty wild," he finally admitted. "There, you see," Grace responded. "Eleanor's just afraid you'll wreck her place. Now, if you just play it cool for a little while, I'm sure she'll stop this nonsense." This last suggestion finally succeeded in gaining Evan's confidence, as it was calculated to do. Eleanor had discovered over time, through various similar incidents, that employing constant direct force and threats was not the most effective method to break the spirit of a rebellious boy. Even with prolonged petticoat punishment, the outcome was always uncertain and never resulted in the complete degree of subjugation she desired. That's why, in Evan's case, Eleanor opted to subjugate him not only through petticoat discipline but also by employing a good cop bad cop approach. Eleanor, naturally, took on the role of the antagonist. With Sophie's skillful assistance, she directly intimidated Evan, coercing him into panties and petticoats, a fact he was acutely aware of. However, Eleanor also intended to utilize Grace as the good cop in Evan's transformation, at least for the time being. While Eleanor would enforce each successive stage of feminization, it was Grace's responsibility to help Evan accept it. Grace, on her part, played her role with adeptness. Drawing from personal experience, she empathized with what Evan was going through. Yet, she did not allow her understanding to temper her manipulative actions. Grace was aware that her only chance for freedom lay in aiding Eleanor's efforts to completely subjugate and transform Evan. Besides, she reminded herself, her stint as the sympathetic figure with Evan would only be temporary. Suppressing an inner smile of vengeful anticipation, Grace proceeded with her assigned task. Meanwhile, Evan yearned for an ally, a confidant, anyone he could trust. "What does she expect from me?" he inquired anxiously, seeking guidance from Grace. It was now Grace's turn to elaborate on the treatment that Eleanor had forcefully initiated. "Just try to cooperate, at least for a while," Grace advised. Evan's response was one of indignation. "Cooperate? After what she's done to me? Oh, if only I could retaliate against her," he exclaimed. Grace sighed in response. "Well then," she remarked, "if that's your attitude, you may as well get accustomed to petticoats because I think you'll be wearing them for quite some time." "Yes, indeed, my dear," she added, "at least throughout the summer, possibly even longer." Evan was horrified at the thought of enduring petticoats for the next 2 months. He felt mortified and genuinely frightened at the prospect. "Please," he pleaded earnestly with Grace, "what can I do? I couldn't bear it. How can she be so cruel?" Grace reassured him that if his behavior improved, Eleanor might reconsider. She pointed out his unladylike sitting posture as an example. Under Grace's guidance, Evan adjusted his posture, placing his feet flat on the floor, crossing his ankles, and pressing his knees together. He smoothed out the wrinkles in his skirt and folded his hands in his lap. "Much better," Grace commended him. "However, Eleanor won't be pleased with the state of your outfit. After all the effort she put into dressing you up, it's disappointing to see everything wrinkled," she remarked, pointing out the creases in Evan's clothing. Grace then assisted Evan in standing and smoothing out his skirt. The best way to avoid trouble with Eleanor, she explained, is to avoid getting into trouble in the first place. This is one of the first things she'll notice. Evan stood before his seated companion as she continued to offer him advice, subtle and feminine, on how to navigate interactions with Eleanor if he hoped to reclaim his freedom and revert to wearing pants. As Grace spoke, she steadied Evan with her left hand while smoothing down the folds of his skirt with her other hand. Her touch ran delicately and gently down his skirted rear, ostensibly to remove wrinkles. However, as Evan stood there, upright with heels together, toes pointed out, and hands folded in front of himself, he couldn't help but notice a different effect. The warmth of Grace's hand on his thigh, the gentle stroking, and the teasing frills of his petticoats all stirred a warm and pleasing sensation deep within his tricot panties. "And one more thing," Grace added, "try to avoid getting your petticoats tangled up during the day. It's bound to happen with all this lacy fabric." Evan remained silent, privately acknowledging that was perhaps the one enjoyable aspect of this situation, the pleasant way the ruffled petticoats moved between his legs. "Whatever you do, never attempt to fix your pettice by hand," Grace cautioned. "That's just what Eleanor would need as an excuse to punish you." Instead, Grace stood up and demonstrated a more acceptable way to walk. Observing Grace, Evan saw her sashay down the hallway and back. "We don't always walk like this, of course. But when you think Eleanor is watching, or when you need to adjust your pettice, this is the safest approach." Grace then instructed Evan to try it himself, reminding him of Eleanor's strictness. Initially hesitant, Evan eventually complied, feeling self-conscious. Grace provided suggestions and had him repeat his attempts several times to ensure you can deceive Eleanor. On his final try, as Evan walked with his back to Grace, she couldn't help but smile at the sight. Attempting to walk as Grace had instructed, Evan swayed his hips from side to side with each step, taking small, mincing steps. The result was a young boy, clad in a training bra, petticoats, and a skirt, strutting down the hall. Grace had to admit, he was already mastering an acceptable mince. She found his appearance so amusing that she had to suppress a laugh by biting her lip. She knew there would be plenty of time for laughter later. Grace hoped that Eleanor would be satisfied with the progress she had made with Evan. The hidden tape recorder under the hardwood bench would serve as evidence of Grace's earnestness and dedication to Eleanor's directives. Grace dared to believe that Eleanor might finally acknowledge her own longing for freedom in a positive light. However, she hesitated to entertain too much hope too soon. Upon opening the door to her study a few moments later, Eleanor was genuinely pleased with the sight before her. Instead of the defiant young man she had encountered earlier that morning, she now beheld what appeared to be a charming young lady. While she acknowledged that much of this transformation was the result of her and Sophie's adept work, she also noted a marked improvement in the deportment of the young man in question. Clearly, this was not how a rebellious 19-year-old boy would typically comport himself. Evan sat with his hands neatly folded in his lap, maintaining an upright posture that subtly revealed the slight padding of his training bra. His knees and heels were aligned, and his shoes rested flat on the floor. Eleanor couldn't help but acknowledge that Grace had executed her role admirably. With a sense of resignation, Eleanor allowed the petticoated boy to enter. Eager to please and avoid further humiliation, Evan obediently stood up and sashayed as instructed. Unaware of the implications, he swayed his hips with each mincing step, unknowingly drawing himself closer to complete feminized subjugation. Eleanor settled into a leather-bound wingback chair. "Come here, please," she commanded Evan. The boy, clad in a bra, approached her, hoping to appease her by displaying his submission. Standing with his heels together, toes pointed outward, and back straight, Evan looked up at Eleanor, trying to maintain his composure despite the discomfort caused by the tight elastic of his training bra. Following Grace's advice, he clasped his hands behind his back, palms together and fingers pointing downwards. Evan couldn't shake off the feeling of fear and degradation as he complied with Eleanor's orders, fully aware of how pathetic and ridiculous he appeared. Yet, He held on to the hope that this display would be enough to satisfy the demands of the domineering woman before him. Recognizing the thoughts likely swirling in her captive's mind, Eleanor ensured she acknowledged and praised the behavior she aimed to encourage. She commended him and expressed contentment with his appearance. But remember, she cautioned sternly, you must maintain this improved behavior until Friday, or I will promptly dismiss you. While she listed her grievances against him, she held out the hope of reform. This greatly heartened Evan, who interpreted it as a sign of liberation from his petticoat discipline. However, Eleanor left the details vague, allowing Evan to harbor his own hopeful illusions. After a brief period, he was excused and directed to the dining room for dinner. Entering the dining room, Evan found the table elegantly set and the aroma of cooking wafting from the kitchen. Grace was already present, standing modestly behind her chair. She informed him of the house rule dictating that neither of them should sit until Eleanor arrived and took her seat. Standing apprehensively behind his tall-backed chair, Evan mimicked Grace's reserved demeanor and posture. Eleanor made her authoritative entrance into the room, took her seat, and neatly placed her napkin in her lap. Following Grace's cues meticulously, Evan seated himself and mirrored each movement, constantly wary of making any misstep that might incur Eleanor's displeasure. Dinner seemed to drag on, yet he was aware that the clock striking 7 times indicated it hadn't been as long as it felt. Conversation was brief, mostly revolving around Eleanor's ongoing lectures on manners and etiquette. Evan was relieved that little attention was directed towards him, as he had anticipated being the focus of discussion. He exchanged occasional knowing glances with Grace, grateful for her apparent concern for his situation. As dinner drew to a close, Eleanor finally shifted her attention to him. I believe we shall retire early tonight, she remarked, checking the time on the grandfather clock. Preparing you for bed will take some time, Evan. You have managed reasonably well today, especially after our discussion. I expect even better behavior tomorrow, as we have much to cover. Now bid Grace good night and head upstairs. Sophie awaits you, she instructed before dismissing him. Folding his napkin, Evan offered a shy smile of gratitude to Grace as he said goodnight. Rising from his seat, he carefully left the room, mindful of Grace's advice regarding his demeanor and posture. As he passed through the foyer and ascended the stairs, he was once again aware of the rustle of his delicate petticoats and the swish of his taffeta skirt with each step. He silently hoped that Grace was right in her assurance that yielding to Eleanor's demands was the best way out of this humiliating predicament. Entering the imposing bedroom that had become emblematic of his subjugation, he braced himself for what lay ahead. And so to bed. Sophie instructed him to disrobe, her stern gaze following his every move as he meticulously hung up the skirt and blouse and neatly arranged the shoes on the rack. Each layer of petticoat was carefully removed and folded, then placed in its designated drawer along with the camisole. Guiding him to the bathroom, she handed him a soft powder blue nightgown made of sheer fabric. He was instructed to remove his panties but to keep the bra on before slipping into the new garment. The ballet-length gown featured delicate lace trim and dainty ribbon accents, its ruffled hem cascading just below his knees. Following Sophie's instructions, he deposited the panties in the clothes hamper before returning to the bedroom to find her busy at the vanity. She briefly left the room to fill 2 small bowls with water, returning to set them on the table. One bowl was topped with a thin layer of foam, into which she briskly immersed his right hand. She sat beside him, closely examining his face. Taking hold of a pair of tweezers, she identified stray eyebrows and plucked them away. Despite his discomfort at the sharp yank of the tweezers, she paid no heed to his protests, continuing to shape his brows into a more elegant arch. Alongside the physical discomfort, he harbored a sense of apprehension, realizing that this particular procedure seemed to suggest a more enduring alteration than the cosmetics or other humiliations he had endured. Moving on, she removed his wet hand from the water, replacing it with his other hand. Using an assortment of tools resembling surgical instruments, she meticulously manicured each nail. Then, she applied a layer of shiny enamel nail polish to each nail, cautioning him to remain still until the varnish had dried. As the nail polish dried, producing a tingling sensation as it hardened over his nails, Sophie silently proceeded to remove the wiglet from the back of his head along with the hairpins that had secured it. She carefully brushed out any tangles before selecting a small section of his natural hair. Dampening the strand with one hand, she skillfully wound it around a brush roller, pulling it tightly against his scalp and securing it with a pin. Working swiftly and efficiently, she repeated this process numerous times until his entire head was covered with the small rollers. He sat silently, observing yet another indignity inflicted upon him, another deliberate assault on his masculinity. As she finished her task, she applied a liquid from the nozzle of an aerosol container to moisten each roller, explaining that it would set the curls, a transformation he would witness more clearly in the morning. In the mirror's light, he glimpsed his hands, noticing the sparkle emanating from each fingernail. Just as if timed, Eleanor entered the room as Sophie was tidying up the table. She inspected her new project, offering a smile of approval. "All set for bed, I see," she remarked. "Well, I want you to have a restful night, as we have a busy day ahead tomorrow." She placed her hand on his shoulder, gently caressing his skin through the silky fabric of the nightdress. "Usually, you would remove your makeup before going to bed, but tonight, I want you to be very aware of it as you drift off. Keep that image of the softly painted face in mind. That's who you'll be in the future. Sweet, feminine, lovely little Evan." Her words, coupled with the smirk on her face, taunted him, and he could feel the flush of self-consciousness creeping over his cheeks. Undeterred, she pressed on. "In fact," she remarked, picking up a lipstick tube, "let's see how well you've learned to apply this tonight." Once more, he watched as the lipstick tube twirled in her hand, producing a column of crimson as she handed it to him. Hesitating, he despised this mocking mistreatment that she seemed to relish. With a sense of revulsion and almost self-hatred, he accepted the tube and felt absurd as he painted the red stain onto his lips. He took the tissue she offered and blotted the color as instructed. "You're making some progress," she commented. "In time, you may even become proficient. Tomorrow, we'll spend a lot of time learning how to make ourselves pretty." The choice of words grated on him. Eleanor, evidently unsatisfied with his appearance, opened a compact of blush and, using a brush, applied more color to his face. "Remember, there will always be moments when you are under Sophie's and my control. Part of your training is to experience the discomfort of being subdued by a woman's hand, feminizing and softening your rough exterior, helping you understand the significance of having your masculine traits suppressed under the guidance of a lady." With each point, it seemed she accentuated it by dusting more of the scarlet powder onto his features. "Such is your fate for the time being, Evan," Eleanor declared. "To be an adorable, winsome little boy in skirts. I shall see you in my study for coffee and rolls at 8:30 sharp." With that directive, she guided him into bed, waiting at the door until Sophie had left. Once he had settled his head on the pillow and pulled the coverlet over him, she smiled once more, switched off the light, and closed the door. It was just past 8:15. Evan awoke, immediately aware of the discomfort caused by the curlers. Like the previous afternoon, it took him a moment to orient himself. Then the reality of his situation dawned on him, and the memories of the preceding day began to replay in his mind. Glancing at the clock, he was relieved to see he hadn't overslept. Eleanor had been quite clear the night before about his expected presence by 8:30. Sitting up, he reached for the despised peignoir that matched his gown. Slipping his feet into the satin slippers by the bed, he stood and draped the second gown over himself. The reflection in the mirror portrayed the image of the surrogate maid he had become, mirroring his every movement. As he gazed at the girl in the mirror, he felt a familiar sensation he had experienced several times the previous evening. The figure that stared back at him was simultaneously him and not him. It was an attractive young woman, he conceded, a realization that made him cringe at the acknowledgement. Still, the strange sensation of identification with the figure in the mirror intrigued him. He was thankful for the privacy of his introspection and the privacy of these feelings, as the fear of being discovered in this state still haunted him. He had been vaguely aware of another sensation, which now commanded his attention. It aroused him in a more typical and familiar way. Waking with his usual morning erection, the delicate touch of the sheer garments against his skin sent a thrilling sensation through him. Indeed, every part of his body tingled with the soft caress of the fabric. Swirling the gown in a hesitant spin, he felt a mix of self-consciousness and disregard. Despite his internal resistance, he experienced both a rush of sensual pleasure and an irrational envy of girls who enjoyed such luxuriant sensations regularly. Entering Eleanor's study, he was overwhelmed by a more instinctual feeling of despair and embarrassment brought on by his attire and appearance. Taking a seat before her desk, he accepted the strong coffee she offered. "This morning will be dedicated to some practice with clothing and makeup, Evan," Eleanor declared. "Your face is a mess." He had noticed the dark circles under his eyes while examining himself in the bedroom mirror. "The reason we usually remove our makeup before bed. Although I instructed you otherwise last night, remember that for the future." She paused to sip from her cup. "On the other hand, I don't like my boys and girls wandering around the house looking plain and ordinary. Therefore, a touch of color is expected after you wash up in the morning. You will learn how." He mentally noted these instructions, recalling her warning at dinner that he must adhere to the household routine or face consequences. "Now, about this morning. As you must have realized by now, this entire process is intended not only to subject you to unfamiliar and unconventional lessons but also to curb what I perceive as a defiant attitude. It's part of the English method I mentioned to you. But there's more to it than that." She paused, taking a sip from her cup, allowing her words to resonate. "My experience," she continued, "and this is the essence of the English method," she added parenthetically, "is that boys subjected to the regimen of petticoat discipline gain insight into their feminine side and the world around them. I believe this insight is valuable, as our world often has men who are insensitive to feminine experiences and dismissive of women's elevated roles. So, that's another aspect of your training. But let's move on from that. Think of it as an additional bonus to your education. We'll discuss more about what it means to be like a young girl your age in the days to come." The conversation was progressing faster than he could fully grasp, and he struggled to process it all. He sensed an underlying theme that hinted at things he wouldn't enjoy, but he felt powerless to object. Eleanor pressed on. "So, let's talk about today's agenda. When girls are young, they spend hours practicing with clothes and makeup. While I don't expect you to approach it with the same enthusiasm, I believe it's an important skill for your development. This morning, you'll practice dolling yourself up and looking darling and precious." He inwardly cringed at her choice of words. This ordeal seemed endless, with new humiliations arising from her imagination. He could only speculate about what she had planned next. "Sophie is currently laying out your first outfit. She'll be tending to your hair, which, I must warn you, might come out quite curly the first time. She'll also lead you through this initial session. She'll oversee your training this morning while I evaluate your progress. I anticipate this first phase will take about an hour. It's crucial to pay close attention to Sophie's instructions as they'll be valuable to you later on." Standing up, she refilled their coffee cups and offered him a plate of croissants. He picked one and took a bite. "After she's finished with you, although you'll be quite involved yourself, you'll return here for my assessment. Looking lovely and presentable, I trust. Is that understood?" She noticed his subdued nod of agreement but wouldn't let the lack of proper acknowledgement slide. "Evan, when I speak or ask a question, I expect a polite and audible yes, min response. Both well-behaved boys and girls are expected to show that courtesy." "Yes, he muttered. "A bit better, we'll work on it. Now, it should take someone approximately half an hour to get dressed and made up, by my estimation. So after I've inspected you, you'll go back to your room and start afresh. It might involve a complete change of outfit or just correcting any deficiencies I notice. But in either case, You'll remove all traces of your current makeup and start over from scratch. New colors, new cosmetics, whatever Sophie decides. Is that also clear? She knew the time she allocated for these procedures was limited, but that was part of the indoctrination. Yes, he articulated this time, with equal lack of enthusiasm. She glanced at the clock. We'll be having lunch at 12:30 today. By my estimation, that will allow you at least 4 practice sessions. Hopefully, you'll have developed some skill and proficiency by the end of the morning. Sitting on the edge of the desk directly above him, she continued, now, if you're late or if you're not properly prepared each time, there will be consequences. I consider this exercise to be a significant part of your education. Unless I see some cooperation and progress by noon, you might find yourself repeating these lessons well into the night. As he finished the bun and coffee, undoubtedly pondering her words, she, too, contemplated the entire plan. The timed drill, inspired by her brother's tales from his military service, was pure harassment. An inspection every 30 minutes in a completely new outfit was a method used by drill instructors not only to ensure uniformity but also to instill discipline. She knew that the repetition of tasks he found detestable would only augment Evan's frustration. Friday was only a day away, and she was confident that she was prevailing in this battle of wills for compliance. She was aware that her threat to extend the morning session into the evening was mere bluster. Achieving any level of proficiency by 10:30 or 11 o'clock would be deemed satisfactory for the day. Mastering the finesse of feminine arts and skills would take weeks, not hours. No, before noon, she had another devious plan brewing. Whatever level of competence Evan attained by 10:30 would no longer be applied to himself. Her mind had wandered earlier to Grace and the events of the previous evening. After Evan's departure, Grace had resumed her complaints about wanting to leave. Their brief altercation had revealed a hint of insolence from Grace, deserving of correction. Furthermore, she couldn't neglect Grace's management while focusing on her new pupil. She inwardly applauded her own cunning. Grace would understand that defiance meant reverting to more juvenile attire and appearance, likely anticipating at least an hour of such punishment. However, what Grace couldn't anticipate was Eleanor's decision to place her in Sophie's care for a transformation into a more childish guise, the Shirley Temple outfits. 2 petticoated Goldilocks at lunch. Grace would be devastated not only by the regression into those clothes but also by the embarrassment of having Evan witness it. It was positively delightful. Lunchtime would serve as the punitive period, and afterward, they would be permitted to change, perhaps into sundresses. Grace was scheduled to take Evan on a tour of the grounds in the afternoon. It would mark Evan's first outing in ruffles, likely leading to an encounter with the groundskeepers, Walter and Samuel. Eleanor savored another inner smile that spread to her lips as she contemplated the plight of the young man before her. Evan had completed his breakfast, and Eleanor checked the time. It was just reaching 9 a.m. Begin now, Evan, dear. Sophie is waiting. I'll expect you back here at 10 o'clock, Eleanor instructed. Evan entered the bedroom to find Sophie had laid out clothing on the newly made bed. Miss Eleanor asked me to lay these out for you. But in the future, I'll just give you a list, and you'll have to do it yourself. Please do it well, as she gets very upset. Now, come here, and I'll start on your hair, Sophie directed. Seated on the familiar skirted stool before the mirror, Evan felt relief as Sophie extricated the pins and pulled the tight rollers from his hair. With each rod removed, his hair sprang back into taut ringlets. Sophie then combed, teased, and pinned the tresses, fashioning a petite hairstyle of golden ringlets around his head. Aware of the time slipping away, Evan watched as Sophie showed him the panties and satiny garter belt, demonstrating how it fit around his waist, outside the panties, as Miss Eleanor insisted. He was already familiar with the cami from the previous day, and the half-slip was essentially a single shimmering petticoat. Sophie was particularly explicit in instructing him on how to put on the gauzy nylon hose, coaching him on rolling them up and letting them glide up his smooth legs. He felt the silky constriction and the odd coolness they imparted as they hugged his legs. He felt uneasy as Sophie's hands fumbled beneath the skirts, demonstrating how to fasten the garters to the top of the hose. Sophie stressed the importance of inspecting the whole effect in the mirror, turning in different directions to ensure everything was in place. Seated at the makeup table, he followed her guidance, attempting to replicate her expertise with eyeliner, shadow, and mascara. While he had slightly better luck with the rouge and had already gained some mastery of the lipstick, the eyes didn't look quite right, but the clock was rapidly approaching 10 o'clock, and he still needed to dress. He donned the blouse she handed him, a white cotton one with a petite Peter Pan collar. Like the robe the previous afternoon, he found the buttons to be backward, fumbling his way through them. Next, he slipped the plaid pleated jumper over his head, being careful not to disturb his hair, and slid his feet into the pumps on the floor. With scarcely half a minute to negotiate the hallway to Eleanor's study, he smoothed the skirt of the dress and discreetly knocked on her door. "Any comments or critiques, Eleanor?" He hurried back to the bedroom for the next change. Bursting in, already pulling the jumper over his head to avoid messing up the curls, he glanced at the second list. It required him to remove the garters and hose, which he did in the bathroom, dropping them in a heap on the hamper. Following Sophie's instructions, he spread the cold cream over his face, rubbing it in and cleansing all traces of the cosmetics. After quickly washing with a soapy cloth, he dried off and returned to the bedroom. The second ensemble called for petticoats and anklets. He could apparently keep the slip and cami on, so he searched through several drawers, amazed by the profusion of dainty items laid out, until he finally found the delicate sateen bloomers. As he slipped them on, he felt the familiar thrill of the soft material against his bare legs and groin. Pulling on the socks, he once again positioned himself before the mirror. This time, he was more careful in sketching the lines below and above his eyes, finding that the brown mascara wand had a shape that made application easier. With a paler rouge this time, he applied the blush and the ubiquitous lipstick, this one in a peach shade. Sophie offered occasional instructions, and he made the corrections she suggested as she gently admonished him. In the rush to meet the deadline, he didn't have much time to dwell on the discomfort of playing the part assigned to him by Eleanor, though he was keenly aware of the unmanly activities he was being coerced into. Finding the dress took some time, as it was a lacy and ornate party dress amidst the array of such frocks in the spacious closet. It had a peach satin sash, and it took a precious 4 minutes to affix it properly. He opted for Mary Eleanor's this time, but their tiny straps and buckles caused further delay. After rummaging through the drawers to find the short white gloves, he hurried out the door with about 5 minutes to spare. Moving more slowly down the hall this time, he was keenly aware of the swish of ruffles beneath the skirt and the whirring sound of the rubbing nylons against his thighs. He repeated this routine twice more. The second costume resembled the first, with a pinafore, for which he needed Sophie's help in locating, hip huggers, 2 petticoats this time, and the need to carefully reapply the garters and draw the delicate hose back on. The makeup routine took a little less time, though he was more meticulous about it after Eleanor's last admonition. In fact, he felt a sense of accomplishment as he finished applying the blush and evenly applied the lipstick within his lip line. The shoes posed a challenge this time. Instead of the flats he was accustomed to, these had a 1-inch heel, causing his pace down the hall to be more unsteady. Furthermore, the hurried pace of the changes had dislodged some of the curls, and despite his efforts to present a neat appearance and apply the makeup more carefully, she was less than complimentary about his efforts. Amidst the pervasive feeling of silliness that accompanied this appearance, he felt strangely disheartened that he had not met her expectations. And so, she directed Sophie herself to oversee the final change of attire and to touch up the makeup and hairstyle. He resignedly returned to the now disheveled room and stripped off everything he had on. The last outfit was a true indignity. The more androgynous underpants were replaced with very ruffled, little girl's panties. 3 layers of petticoats, shorter than those he wore the previous night, were draped over these, starched, stiff crinolines that stuck out far from his legs. The anklets returned, embroidered with small roses. Sophie kindly fastened the Mary Eleanor's again. The dress itself was another party dress, this time a princess party frock with a short skirt that allowed the crinolines to peek out from the fringe, and an enormous satin sashed bow that Sophie fashioned in a large bow in the back. She then meticulously corrected the mass of curls using her combs, brushes, and the curling iron. Adding a touch of fresh color to his cheeks, eyes, and lips, she transformed him. As he stood before the full-length mirror, watching her affix the large bow in his hair, he couldn't help but notice that the outfit was not only excessively feminine but also exceedingly childish. He looked like a teenager pretending to be an 8-year-old girl. More significantly, he was acutely aware that he was a teenage boy pretending to be a pretty 7-year-old girl. He almost wished he were back in one of the more mature styles he had worn earlier. With a profound sense of embarrassment, he clacked down the hallway in his patent shoes, petticoats bobbing, and headed to lunch. When Evan entered the dining room, he noticed Grace wearing a similarly absurd outfit. Hers was a pink princess dress with a gauzy apron, paired with matching pink Mary Eleanor's. Like his own dress, the skirt's hem floated on layers of stiff petticoats. While the dress seemed immature and childish on him, it didn't appear as outlandish on Grace, and he felt relieved not to be dressed in pink. As ludicrous as he felt, the turquoise satin was far more preferable to him. Grace didn't speak to him, and her downcast eyes betrayed a sense of shame. He guessed this was some form of punishment, and he wondered what had prompted Eleanor to impose this indignity on Grace. Before he could inquire, Eleanor entered the room, took her seat, and gestured for them to do the same. Eleanor smiled to herself as she observed the two ribbon-adorned youngsters struggling to sit in their juvenile attire, perched atop their chairs amidst billows of ruffled petticoats. Evan sat quietly and despondently throughout the meal, clearly ill at ease, while Grace was practically sullen. Evan's discomfort was evident from his constant shifting. He found the layers of satiny slips beneath the short dress cumbersome and was further troubled by the need to constantly emulate the mannerisms and demeanor demanded by Eleanor, which Grace had coached him on the night before. Despite his attire, though he was reluctant to admit it, he almost longed for the more mature ensembles he had worn earlier. This sentiment was exacerbated by having to endure Eleanor's gratuitous comments about how adorable they looked and how sweet their dresses were. She showered them with what he considered unnecessary compliments, praising everything from the flounce of their undergarments to the curls and ribbons in their hair. At one point, she addressed Evan, saying, "I've rarely seen young boys who look as pretty as you do dressed as a girl. Your lashes, some girls would envy them, so long and full. I quite like your hair that shade, and it's a pity it isn't quite long enough yet for you to have your own lovely curls." To Grace, she remarked, "It's been a while since I've seen you in that cute dress, Grace. Pink really suits you, you know. I think you should wear pink more often. And those bouncy crinolines. Such a lovely little doll." It was profoundly humiliating for Evan, a form of teasing and taunting degradation that he silently endured throughout the hour-long lunch, except for quietly acknowledging one of her compliments. Eleanor had commented on his peaches and cream complexion and how wonderfully the makeup softened his face, but when he remained sullen, she harshly scolded him for his perceived impoliteness in not thanking her for the compliments. His face reddened as he mumbled a thank you, but he remained mostly silent for the rest of the meal. Eleanor suspected that Grace's brooding demeanor largely stemmed from being forced back into this immature state. Indeed, that was true, but Grace's reticence wasn't solely due to the reprimand imposed by the domineering figure across the table. In fact, Grace harbored an odd mix of emotions toward Evan as well. She pitied his situation and understood how he must feel being disgraced in this manner. Having experienced the early stages of this mistreatment herself, it was easy for her to sympathize with the hapless lad. Grace also harbored a small degree of resentment toward Evan. While it wasn't rational to blame him, it was easier for her to direct some anger at him than it was to rebel against Eleanor directly. After all, even though she hadn't gotten into trouble because of Evan, she had been chastised for her role in his presence here. After lunch, Eleanor delivered a lecture on the importance of obedience, emphasizing that such punishments were the inevitable result of defiance. She asked each of them if they had learned their lessons about obedience and respect, and if they desired to change out of their current outfits. Without hesitation, they both vehemently agreed. "Very well," she declared, "then both of you should change into something more suitable for spring. Grace, I think it would be a lovely day for you to give Evan a tour of the grounds. Sophie is waiting upstairs for you, Evan," Eleanor continued, "and I've asked her to prepare an outfit that's a personal favorite of mine. Run along now and change immediately." The idea of venturing outdoors didn't sit well with Evan, but if they were only exploring the estate grounds, he felt a bit less apprehensive. At least he wouldn't resemble Shirley Temple out there. Following Eleanor's instructions to depart, Evan left the dining room while Grace remained behind as per Eleanor's instruction. As he left the dining room, Evan felt a mix of relief and frustration, mindful of his posture and demeanor to avoid further displeasure from Eleanor. Making his way through the foyer and ascending the stairs, he was acutely aware of the rustling of his skirts and caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror on the lower landing. Pausing at the mirror, he checked his face closely, ensuring no one was observing him. He examined the lashes that Eleanor had praised, noticing how the ginger-hued mascara enhanced their length and curliness. He had heard similar comments about his eyelashes before, and each time it elicited a wince from him. Reluctantly, he had to acknowledge to himself that the clothing and other embellishments did indeed create an attractive appearance for a girl. He mused to himself that any girl who desired those lashes and that complexion could have them, and he wouldn't miss them one bit. Such feminine attributes held no appeal for him. These reflections triggered that familiar mixture of apprehension and fascination that he had felt multiple times since yesterday, the puzzle of being attired in such a manner and the peculiar excitement it stirred within him. However, his aversion to this altered image of himself quickly overshadowed any fleeting sense of enjoyment. He focused solely on the despondent unease that gripped him. Tomorrow marked Friday, a deadline that Eleanor had mentioned to him the day before. Although he might have interpreted her remark too optimistically, he clung to the hope that the vague promise of relief from this ordeal would materialize. He couldn't endure this absurdity much longer. Understanding the importance of complying with Eleanor's demands to secure a favorable report to the school, he simply yearned to discard these skirts as soon as possible. As he trudged along the upstairs hallway toward the bedroom door, his apprehension deepened. Behind that closed portal awaited the pastel chamber of torment he had been subjected to for nearly 36 hours. Beyond it, he knew, awaited Sophie, whose faithful execution of her mistress' instructions continued to expose him to silks, satins, and colorful pigments that distorted his features into a caricature of his true gender. A cold lump of resigned frustration churned in his stomach as he turned the knob. Meanwhile, Grace ascended the stairs lost in thought a few moments later. Eleanor's recent lecture had suggested that yesterday evening's transgressions had been partially mitigated by the humiliating attire at lunch, but Grace's management of the afternoon's activities would ultimately determine her fate. Recalling her first arrival here 6 months prior as Brian, it felt strange to reminisce about that name in this context. Just days after stepping through the walnut doors last December dressed in trousers and a blazer, Eleanor had christened the crinoline-clad youth as Grace, and that had been her identity in this house ever since. Soon, Evan would discover he was to stay indefinitely, and he, too, would swiftly adopt a new name, just as swiftly as he had been adorned in skirts. From now on, Evan would be Evelyn or something similar. Regrettably, Eleanor had tasked Grace with the responsibility of selecting a name, as Eleanor's instructions for the estate tour emphatically dictated a meeting with the stable workers. A new name for Evan's introduction was imperative, and Grace was tasked with making the choice for the new girl. Grace winced, remembering her initial encounter with them as Brian, when they had encountered the men on the lower road, and Brian had internally quaked, praying that nothing would betray his true gender to them. The men had warmly greeted this new girl, and the secret had remained concealed until now. Soon, it would be Evan's turn, and Grace felt a compassionate pang of sympathy for him. This brings us to the end of Part 1. For Parts 2 and 3, visit the link in description.